Hi, everyone. Welcome to our channel Captain World. Douglas Macgregor has described this event as quite extraordinary, using the term crazy to characterize it. He points out the Western misunderstanding of Russia and Russians, leading to flawed interpretations of events. Macgregor suggests that this situation requires a different perspective. He mentions Prigozhin, highlighting his flamboyant and outspoken nature, noting both positive and negative aspects. Within the upper echelons of the Russian military, Prigozhin is perceived as a figure with both strengths and liabilities. Obviously, Wagner has been exceptionally effective, viewed within Russia much like the French Foreign Legion is seen within France. Wagner isn't perceived as a mercenary group, despite having foreigners and some convicted criminals in its ranks under certain conditions. Rather, they're staunchly loyal to the Russian state, much like the revered French Foreign Legion. They're highly esteemed for their combat prowess akin to the Legion, which faces little criticism in France. This popularity extends to the Wagner Group and Prigozhin in Russia, where many see them as champions against Ukraine. Prigozhin is admired by Russians for his aggressive stance against Ukraine and his desire to remove Zelensky. However, there have been tensions between Prigozhin and the Russian High Command. Legal issues and domestic deployment of Wagner have caused rifts, with senior military figures considering disbandment against Prigozhin's wishes. Prigozhin's criticism of the High Command, though sometimes shared, has strained relations. He argues for a more aggressive prosecution of the war, rejecting terms like special military operation in favor of a declared war and national mobilization. While Prigozhin seeks Putin's attention, it's not accurate to label his actions as an attempted coup. Rather, he aims to influence Putin's approach. I believe the actions taken were excessive, risking significant bloodshed with a relatively small force heading towards Moscow. However, the primary aims seem to be catching Putin's attention, signaling concerns about his senior leadership. Despite different perspectives on this, the principal goal wasn't about seizing power, but rather prompting Putin to reassess his leadership circle. Some within the Wagner troops saw their mission as rescuing Putin from his generals, though this is contested. Putin's decision not to arrest or execute Prigozhin and his troops reflects several factors acknowledging their patriotism and the lack of a credible threat to his authority. Putin's leniency shouldn't be interpreted as weakness, but rather as a demonstration of strength and strategic thinking. Now that the incident has concluded, the key question is whether Putin has grasped the need for reforms within the High Command and the desire for an end to the war among the Russian people. There's also concern about potential provocations from Ukraine, particularly regarding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which could escalate tensions further. The departure of Prigozhin and his followers leaves uncertainty about the future actions of the Wagner Group, a force too skilled to be dismissed lightly. As this chapter closes, attention turns to potential changes within the Russian military leadership and the timing of any new offensives. There are two primary reasons behind this. Firstly, President Putin has long been hesitant to engage in direct military confrontation with the West, a stance that continues. His initial expectations upon entering Ukraine were unrealistic based on the flawed assumption that a limited show of force would lead to negotiations. However, it became evident over several months that the West perceived this as a sign of weakness rather than a gesture for negotiation. Consequently, Putin had to regroup, heeding the advice of senior leadership that more troops were necessary. The current involvement of nearly 750,000 troops in discussions about further mobilization reflect Putin's acknowledgement that negotiation seems increasingly unlikely. He understands the resistance of true Ukrainians residing west of the river to Russian influence. His strategy now likely involves securing the rest of eastern Ukraine, then moving towards Odessa with pauses to assess international developments. Putin observes global events closely, noting factors like the United States' growing debt, opposition to war within the U.S., economic challenges in Germany, and domestic political dynamics in France and the UK. These factors inform his cautious yet deliberate approach, avoiding sudden escalations while pressing forward steadily. He anticipates moments of pause and perhaps a reassessment of priorities in Europe, where he perceives a lack of coherent realism across various fronts. Absolutely, there's no denying that, and it's deeply concerning. When you realize that your own financial system is on the brink of collapse and the possibility of a severe recession or even a depression looms large, it's crucial to demonstrate a commitment to fiscal discipline and spending cuts to gain the cooperation of creditors. However, the current administration's approach seems erratic, akin to a roller coaster veering off its tracks towards a looming crisis. It's essential to revisit the fundamentals as Franklin Roosevelt did in the 1930s, when he effectively defaulted and restructured the debt amidst economic turmoil. Roosevelt's measures included restarting the scientific and industrial base and significant spending cuts, notably in defense. Such actions were necessary to gain creditor support. Yet the current administration's lack of seriousness in addressing the debt raises doubts about its credibility with creditors like Saudi Arabia, Japan, and China. Furthermore, there's a growing trend among nations, particularly the BRICS countries, to seek alternatives to the existing financial system dominated by the U.S., evidenced by their efforts to collaborate with Russia, China, and India. The flaws in the U.S. financial system aren't limited to the dollar itself, but also involve the tendency to use financial sanctions as a tool for political coercion, affecting over 34 nations. This approach is increasingly untenable and has eroded trust. While some European nations continue to align closely with the U.S., largely due to a lack of alternative strategies, the broader global sentiment is shifting away from unquestioning obedience. The reluctance of Washington to acknowledge its mistakes exacerbates the situation, leading inevitably to a collapse. The future appears uncertain, with doubts about the current administration's stability and effectiveness. The possibility of significant changes, perhaps even before the next election, looms large, potentially involving drastic measures such as substantial defense spending cuts and a dismantling of the imperialist framework. Similar to the decline of the Roman Empire or attraction of military presence and a return to a domestic focus may signal a transformational shift in U.S. policy. Indeed, the emergence of the BRICS nations, along with 84 other countries, considering a shift towards a gold-backed or basket currency, signals a gradual transition away from the dollar. While it may take time to establish comparable financial institutions like SWIFT, confidence in these alternative systems needs to grow. Despite its flaws, the dollar will likely persist until a superior alternative arises, which could be Bitcoin, given its independence from traditional banking systems. The current disillusionment with banks, seen as controlled by a global elite, fuels the inevitability of Bitcoin's ascent. This sentiment is echoed by figures like Donald Trump and RFK Jr. who oppose the influence of this elite. Reflecting on my upbringing in a tight-knit patriotic neighborhood in North Philadelphia, I lament the loss of community cohesion and safety. In the past, neighbors looked out for one another, fostering a sense of security and pride in our homes. Today, however, urban areas resemble war zones, a tragic transformation fueled by neglect and misguided policies. To reclaim this sense of community, we must address fundamental questions about American identity and values. Upholding the rule of law and meritocracy while respecting diverse cultures is essential. We must prioritize domestic prosperity and security over intervening in foreign affairs, returning to the principle of non-interference. Restoring safety in our streets may require decisive action, including robust law enforcement and potentially military intervention.